All right, Eonin here, bringing you my review of the ProTech Malibu with the textured finish scales. Basic specs: Crucible 20 CV blade steel, 3/4 flat grind, stone washed blade, aluminum liners, which also double as the scales. It's riding on dual ceramic ball bearings. It has a button lock design. Didn't close. With a manual flipper tab. And we've got 3 1/4 inches of usable fine edge here, 4 1/4 inch total scale length, and a 7.5 inch tip to tail length. The weight on my digital scale was 3.1 ounces. That is very light. Anything right around 3 ounces or less I consider to be a very light knife. So let's jump into the likes. This is the third ProTech Malibu that I have had the opportunity to handle, but it's the first one that I've had for a considerable amount of time been able to carry and put into actual use so that I could review this knife fully. The hype on this knife is high. It is on par with the Nimble, but more on that later. The textured version would be my preference. It's a small, lightweight knife with good blade steel. The best part about this knife is the blade. The 20 CV is well heat treated. It's a really nice blade, well finished, cuts great, great edge retention. I put this knife through some paces with some cardboard and some other small cutting tasks. Doesn't even need to be stropped or resharpened or anything. It's perfect. It's held up really good. So kudos to ProTech for that. Thumbs up, guys. Generally, this knife fits into the small EDC category, folder category very well. I would not consider this a large knife. I would consider this a medium, small to medium. And my large glove size hands, I can get all fingers on the back. I'm right at the edge of where this starts to turn right there, where it's got that, bevel to it. But the knife is holdable with all 4 fingers. So good to go on that. So let's get to the dislikes or the issues. Here, folks, here is where I diverge from the majority of the knife community crowd, and especially I diverge from the Malibu fanboys and girls. Honest reviews, right? So I'm just going to give you my honest thoughts on my issues and dislikes with this knife. First of all, the pocket clip. Way too stiff on all 3 knives that I've handled. Had to pull this thing up a few times and kind of just give it a little bit, take a little bit of the pressure off, because it was unusable. It would not go into a light or medium weight pair of pants at all with this pocket clip. It would just try to rip the fabric. And it came out really hard, and it still does. This pocket clip is still really hard. If this were my knife, I'd probably mess with it some more to try to get it a little better adjusted. It's reasonably comfortable. You don't really feel it because it does have a narrow spoon down here, so I'll give them credit for that, but it is way, way too stiff. And all 3 versions of this knife I've handled have had ridiculously stiff pocket clips. Don't know if I own the knife permanently. If that would wear in over time, I would probably just adjust it right off the bat and be done with it. So the clip is an issue for me. The next thing is that the knife lacks any meaningful jimping. The only jimping on this knife is here. There's 4 or 5 little jimps on the flipper tab just so you can flip the knife open. There's no jimping on the spine of the blade or on the back of the scales. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The ergos on the knife. So, people rave about this knife all the time, but these kind of knives that go from fatter to thinner back here are a little sketchy in terms of ergos. I like the fact that they left the handle flat open and then they didn't put a really big, ridiculous scallop, relief here. But where this knife kind of curves and rounds off back here, and the fact that it gets narrower and more rounded, my opinion is, and it would be more pronounced on the flat ones, which is why I think I sought out a textured one to review, is that when you squeeze this knife, especially because it's narrow, and you squeeze your hand around the back of it, your fingers wrap all the way around, and the knife kind of wants to go that away. Just a little sensation of the knife wanting to kind of go like that in an arc. And that's the same no matter where you hold it. It feels like it wants to come up out of the back of your palm here, right? If you had jimping here on the back of the blade or on the top portion of the scale, boom, that issue would be mitigated. It would be better. But because the knife doesn't have any jimping, I think the only saving grace for this in this situation is the textured scale, which lets you have a good positive feel on the knife, even though it does tend to feel like it wants to go like that. So that is an issue for me, and that's why I would only recommend the textured version, and I really think the lack of meaningful jimping hurts the ergos of this knife. Finally, I'm going to get to the most important thing that I ran into in my time with this knife. So this knife is on loan to me from a very good friend in the knife community, Cue Ball. He let me have this knife. I've had a good amount of time to use this knife and to get acquainted with this knife. And my very first day, day one of carrying this knife, I was not at work. I was not hard using it. I was not taking it in and out of my pocket a dozen times like I do at work on a lot of days. I maybe took it in and out of my pocket 5 or 6 times. I used it for some small things around the house. I cut up a cardboard box that came in the mail. I took it out of my pocket at the end of the day, and there's a scratch on it. Right there. There's a scratch. It's actually like a scratch in the beginning of another small scratch. Right there. It's small, but you can see it here. There's an actual scratch on the texturing, and then the beginning of another piece of the texturing coming off right there. Is it small? Yes. Did I let Cue Ball know and talk to him about it? Yep, I sure did. And he was very understanding and understood that, anytime you're using and reviewing knives, there's a possibility they could get scratched. But I still let him know because that's what friends do and that's how your honest people react. But one day, I carried it one day and it scratched. And so it made me a little gun shy to carry it and use it for bigger tasks, but I have carried it for a few weeks now. I have put it through a few more carry cycles, and I've been really careful with it, super careful, like more careful than I have with any other knife I've ever reviewed. But I just feel like that's not something I feel like should happen on a knife at this price point and a knife that's this highly hyped up by everyone. I just don't feel like the coating should scratch up after a day. So is it an anomaly? Maybe, but it's not something I've had happen on a lot of knives after just one carry or even a few carries. So that's of concern to me. So let's do a couple of quick size comparisons so I can give you an idea of what this knife kind of compares to in this class. So we're going to stick with button locks. Here is a Kaiser Original in 154 cm. You can see that this knife is a little shorter blade-wise and a little smaller handle-wise. Honestly, I think the original is a more comfortable knife, a 154 cm versus 20 CV, so not as nice as steel. But again, boy, this knife is a fidget beast right here. This knife, in my opinion, is more fidgety than this knife. And again, I've held 3 of these. They all kind of have similar actions to them. But this knife right here is great. Okay, so that's the Kaiser Original next to the ProTech Malibu. Next one up is going to be another Kaiser. This is the swayback in N690. You can see the swayback is a little shorter, again, blade-wise. Close, similar blade, handle length, scale length. Not quite. It's a little bit smaller knife. Again, it's about the same width, though, as the ProTech Malibu. And again, another really nice knife, N690. Pretty fidgety knife and not super expensive. And then finally, I'm going to throw in a knife that's one size up, and that would be the Civivi Conspirator. Again, a button lock, Nitro V blade. Obviously, we're talking about an American-made knife here with the ProTech Malibu versus a wee Civivi knife that's not made in the USA. But function-wise, butter. I mean, absolute, I just hit the table, but absolute butter, folks. This knife is amazing. It's an amazing knife. Now, again, I understand this is not an American-made knife, but this is probably one of my favorite button locks that I own. This is a really nice knife. So where does that leave us on the ProTech Malibu? Do I think this is a good knife? Yes. Do I think there's some solidness to this knife in terms of design? Some of it. I like the blade. I like the grind. I like what it does cutting wise. I generally like the look of the knife. It's a very attractive looking knife. It also comes in a Wharncliffe instead of a reverse Tanto. But I feel like at the $260 price range, which is typically where this is, you very seldomly ever see these on sale. Why? Because they're not in stock very often. I get that they're popular. I just don't know if this knife offers the kind of value that I think it should offer. Again, I know it's an American knife company. I know it's American made. I know that ProTech makes it, but the hype around this knife, for me, is not real. And I have friends in the knife community who love this knife and think this is the most fidgety knife they've ever held, and it's in their top 4 or 5 knives ever as far as favorites, and that's all well and good. They're completely entitled to that opinion. For me, finally getting one of these in my hand, the hype for me is not real. It just doesn't match up to what my expectations of this knife were. I don't expect to get a reasonably expensive knife in my hand that everybody raves about and have issues with it. Again, it wasn't a nimble for me. It wasn't something that blew me away and met my expectations, let's say. So there you go, folks. That is my review and my opinions on the ProTech Malibu, the textured version of this knife in 20 CV, Stonewashed Tanto blade. About $260 street value. I would tell you to be careful about buying one of these. Maybe handle one, maybe try one before you spend your hard-earned cash on it. Not a bad knife, but not one that knocked my socks off either. All right, folks, thank you for Cue Ball for loaning me the knife. Thank you guys for tuning in. And as always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp.